ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
On the map, wedged between India and Thailand, is the beautiful nation of Myanmar, which used to be known as Burma. Myanmar is at the centre of one of history's great civilisations. But for the last 6 decades or so, Myanmar's mostly been governed by a military dictatorship with a totalitarian streak. And so the people of Myanmar now suffer terrible hardship and poverty and are subject to ongoing state surveillance and violence. Sean Turnell is my guest today. Sean loves Myanmar and its people. Sean is an Australian economist. He's worked at the Reserve Bank, the International Monetary Fund. Today, Sean is a senior fellow at the Lowy Institute. And in 2016, Sean was appointed as a special advisor to the dissident turned political leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, who had become the Prime Minister of Myanmar during its brief period of democratic reform. Then, in February 2021, there was a military coup. Sean was alerted that he was in danger. But before he could get out, he was arrested. He was imprisoned and interrogated for months on end. And then he stood trial, charged with breaching Myanmar's Official Secrets Act. Sean tried to hold his mind and body together while he suffered imprisonment under brutal and inhumane conditions. But meanwhile, a massive international effort was underway, led by the Australian government and by his wife Ha, to have him freed. Sean's memoir of his extraordinary 2 years in captivity is called An Unlikely Prisoner. Hello, Sean.
Hello, Richard.
What drew you to Burma, or Myanmar as it's now known, when you were a student?
In the usual way, totally by accident, Richard. I lived in a share house with other PhD students in the early 1990s, and one of them happened to be from Myanmar. Her family was actually forced to flee in the 60s when the military first took over. So I got to know her, got to know the Myanmar community, got to love Burmese history, Burmese food, Burmese culture, and it gradually just sucked me in. It's a place that does that to you.
I have friends of mine when I was a student in Canberra, and they'd visited Myanmar because their parents were working there with an aid agency, and they came back saying, oh, it's the most beautiful place. It was suffering in those days. This is the 80s under General Ne Win, who ran the place for decades, and they said it's a political nightmare, but nonetheless the most beautiful place. Is that about right?
Yeah, that captures it perfectly. And also the people, the most wonderful people, ruled over decade after decade by the most awful people. So, yeah, that contradiction is just at the heart of the place.
So how soon did you then start to become more plugged into the Burmese expatriate community in Australia after you met this flatmate of yours?
It was actually quite quickly, if I think about it in retrospect. And they got to hear I was an economist. So I started writing about the economy, essentially to help the opposition movement, to critique military rule, to come up with other avenues through which we could do advocacy and things like that. And, you know, one thing led to another, and gradually my life was taken over by the study of Myanmar, its economy.
What kind of stories were you hearing from that community about the conditions people were living under in Burma in those days?
Oh, truly awful. It was very much a totalitarian state. And in that old-fashioned way, you know, I think the only thing close to it would be, you know, what we hear goes on in North Korea, East Germany and so on. So really hermit kingdom, as well as, you know, just human rights abuses and so on. So very isolated. All of my Burmese friends, just about all of them, spent lengthy periods in the prison, locked in cells for months on end. And so I remember thinking about that, just how bad that would be, and looking at them and thinking, gosh, you know, how did you survive things like that without any sort of idea that, you know, that could ever happen to me?
Was there some kind of far-out state ideology that was put in place in Burma/Myanmar in those days?
There was at the beginning, Richard. So in 1962, when the military first took over, they brought in this thing called the Burmese way to socialism. And it was the full-on Stalinist horror. You know, so state ownership and control of everything, all the way down to the corner shop, taxis, things like that. So very ideological. But it was hopeless, frankly, and it fell apart within a couple of years. And so thereafter it was just a military junta without, you know, that they'd sort of pretend there was some sort of overall plan, but no one was convinced, including them. So it was sort of like a ramshackle dictatorship from then on for about the next 30 years.
So it went pretty quickly from early Soviet to late Soviet style, which is a cynical kind of post-ideological regime that's in power for its own sake. But normally the deal with an authoritarian military government like that is the deal is we run the country, and in return we give you economic prosperity and some stability. But the government could do none of these things by the sound of things.
It could do nothing like that. It was wildly irrational and incompetent. So one thing they did once, that General Ne Win, who you mentioned, he tried to catch speculators out, and he just suddenly declared the currency to be no longer legal tender and reintroduced a new series of currency notes based on the number 9 instead of the decimal system.
My God.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
Right.
And another time he got upset at England, and he thought the way it sort of getting back at the UK was to suddenly declare that cars that had been driving on the right now had to drive on the left. And with all the subsequent mayhem of that. So, yeah, a really irrational regime. To the extent there was any sort of informative aspect to the general's thinking, it came from soothsayers, astrologers, numerologists. So, yeah, completely madcap regime.
Was there that other critical component of a Stalinist regime, which was concentration camps, re-education camps, mass disappearances, mass murder, mass starvation and the like?
Unfortunately, there was all of that too. So whilst there were comic elements to this regime, there was that particular hardcore as well, which, yeah, had all of those things.
So what had led you to take that job in 2016 when you were offered that job to be a special advisor to the former dissident turned effectively Prime Minister Aung San Suu Kyi?
I was offered the job on the morning after Aung San Suu Kyi won the election in November 2015. So I'd been in Yangon for the election, the incredible victory of the National League for Democracy. The whole place sort of erupted. People were so happy. It felt like anything was possible. And I went round to see her the next morning after the election and, just to pay my respects and so on, because I got to know her and all that. And she turned to me in the middle of all of this and just said, "Sean, it's time to put your money where your mouth is. Come over and help us." Now, at that time, I didn't think I could. I was at Macquarie Uni. I had essays to mark. I had classes to do. And I said, "Look, Dorsu," which is what I called her, "I'd love to do it, but I'm not sure if I can, but I'll see what I can do." I happened to mention it to the Australian ambassador that same evening, who said, "Sean, do you want to do this?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I would, but I don't see how I could." And he said, "Let's see if I can arrange it." And very, very quickly, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade here, moved heaven and earth. And within a few months, I was in Yangon and with the government.
But nonetheless, what you're asked to do is help that poor country shift from a system based on astrology, numerology and soothsayers and a defunct state ideology and whatever the gangster-like military regime wants to an open economy, to root out corruption. Did you even think that was going to be possible, or what did you tell yourself about the possibilities that were there for Myanmar at the time?
I did think it was possible, Richard. Yeah, I'd spent a lot of time reading and studying economic transition, all the lessons of Eastern Europe, the lessons of the tiger economies in Asia, and it seemed to me that economics was not the full answer at all. I'm not like one of those economists who think economics is everything. Politics is really still number one. But nonetheless, economics can be an avenue. So, yeah, I really thought that we could create the economic foundation. So that was the mission. Open the economy up, bring in competition, plug Myanmar into the world, just as the other Asian economies did, places like Vietnam so successfully. So that was the vision. And I thought with just a little bit of luck, we'd pull it off.
In the Eastern European economies, once they shrugged off communism, the secret police that had been all-powerful in those countries decided to walk away from the regime because they saw a way that they could get rich in a new open economy. Was such things discussed, like to find some way to get the formerly powerful people to buy in and make them rich in what would be the new economy?
That was a real dilemma, Richard. You've captured the spirit of the place well, actually, because there had emerged at that time a group of what we called the cronies, crony business people who were not great entrepreneurs at all, but had got rich by attaching themselves to the government and winning contracts and all that. So one of the dilemmas we had was how to bring people like that on side, because they were incredibly rich and powerful, deeply connected to the military, but at the same time undermine them because, we're trying to bring in competition, open things up and so on. So that dilemma was with us all the way through. And in fact, it would lead to our undoing by the end.
So that led you to work in Myanmar. in its new capital. Now, I wasn't even aware until I read your book that Myanmar had a new capital, a place called Naypyidaw. What is Naypyidaw? What is this city? Is this kind of like their Canberra or something?
It is like their Canberra. It's Canberra without the fun bits. So if you can imagine just this bureaucratic place with monumental buildings that are designed to intimidate. So the population looks at them and to give the message, you are very small and we are very powerful. So it's a very bizarre place. The roads are massive, the 10-lane highways, 20-lane highway in front of the main parliament. So it's a city on a massive scale, but widely dispersed. So it's actually designed so that protesters, for instance, couldn't get on the streets and get from building to building. A lot of the highways also designed for fighter planes and bombers, etc., to land. So it was designed from the outset to intimidate and also to potentially be a last redoubt of the regime should the people rise up against them. So it's a very scary place, but again, it's almost funny. It's comic in many ways, not least because it's also falling apart. So even though it's very new, it was only built in 2005, but most of the buildings, the building standards are awful, frankly, and so the buildings are beginning to fall apart. So, these things designed to intimidate and so on, they sort of send a message about the decrepit nature of the regime as much as anything else.
Was this built in secret, this city? It was built in secret in 2005? I wonder how you even do that, build a city, a capital in secret.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Because I got to hear about it because I was working on Myanmar even at that time, but back here in Australia, and there were rumours spreading around it about what was being built. And at first it was said it was going to be a big military base with bunkers for generals and things like that. Then it became apparent that it was a capital. And then it was suddenly announced at a very auspicious time, and all the public servants who had been in Rangoon or Yangon, the old capital, were suddenly ordered up to Naypyidaw. They had to catch a specific train. From memory, it was the 657 from Yangon to Naypyidaw. And again, all the numbers chosen because they were auspicious, according to numerologists. So the entire civil service were moved at very short notice up to this bizarre capital city. So, yeah, everything about it was bizarre, sinister, but, almost comic as well.
I mentioned the political difficulties in making that transition to an open economy and a democratic system and all that. How hard is it to shift from a Stalinist economic system where the state runs everything or purports to run everything to an open economy?
It's incredibly tough, Richard. The younger people responded well. People in the private sector responded well because they saw opportunities. So there was a huge upsurge of growth in selected areas of the economy. One of the big problems we had was the bureaucracy because it had been created to service this military socialist state. There they are all cooped up in Naypyidaw. Just trying to get them to just think differently was very, very difficult. So, yeah, the bureaucracy was just incredibly rigid and hierarchical, difficult to move in any direction. So we would come up with what we thought were really good policies, but getting them through to the bureaucracy and getting in implementation was incredibly difficult. So, yeah, really tough.
I interviewed the brilliant journalist Mei Fong a couple of years ago. She'd written this great book about China's one-child policy. And the rulers of China, when they instituted it, thought it was something like a tap they could turn on and off. But in bringing about this kind of new set of rules and laws that intruded so much into people's lives, what in effect happened was a huge bureaucracy was created around to enforce the laws. And that meant it made it almost impossible to repeal that law because there was so much investment by a huge bureaucracy in enforcing that law. Were you having the same problems there?
We sure were. I'll never forget the first day I walked into the Ministry of Finance and just looked at a sea of desks buried under massive piles of paper. But what sparked my interest was that these great piles of paper were tied up with red ribbon. And I just laughed. And
Literally red tape?
Literally red tape. One of my Burmese friends couldn't understand why I was laughing. And I just said, red tape? I was like, really? Yeah, so...
Well, it's nice when the red tape identifies itself to you so readily like that, isn't it?
Indeed.
You know what you're going to deal with then. Were you advocating something like shock therapy, like was what happened in Russia after the collapse of communism, or a more gradual transition?
It's a great question, Richard, because I think shock therapy is probably the way to go. But we were sort of in a bit of a halfway house. I think in retrospect, we should have gone in harder and stronger, particularly when the National League for Democracy, when it first came in, it had immense political capital and support from outside. And I think we should have gone harder at that point, cleared out the civil service and got some of the bolder reforms in. We went a little bit slow, so it was sort of a mix between a sort of shock therapy and something much more gradual. But the gradual nature of it did mean that some of the older elements were able to regroup and fight back. And so, so the struggle was always there. So I'm minded now to think that, shock therapy, I know it gets a bad press, but I think in the Myanmar context, it probably would have been a better approach.
What you were proposing to do, in effect, had massive political consequences. What you were going to do, in effect, you're asking a government to try and take power away from the military. And you were a foreigner coming in to do this as well, and the military has played on xenophobia in Myanmar. Were you getting threats while you were in that job from unknown quarters or people in the military?
Yeah, I was getting threats because one of the principal things we were trying to fix up was that under Myanmar's 2008 constitution, the military has total control over its own budget. It just decides what money it needs, gives a note to the government, says you've got to give us this. So there we are trying to fix the fiscal situation, the monetary situation, and yet by far the biggest area of spending was totally beyond our control. Also, the military was totally beyond any sort of political control as well. They were an autonomous unit. So it was really problematic, and as you suggest, it meant that we were butting up against very powerful interests all the time, and they were not shy at showing that.
So we come to the 1st of February 2021. Where were you when you were told that the military had launched a coup d'etat and had arrested Aung San Suu Kyi? What was going on?
I was in a hotel in Yangon. I was quarantining because of COVID. So I'd briefly come back to Australia, got stuck a bit in Australia because of COVID, come back to Yangon, had to quarantine for 2 weeks in a hotel. The very day that I was due to come out of quarantine, the coup took place. And I got a call from friends from the United States, actually, in the hotel room at about 3 a.m, just saying, Sean, there's been a coup. You probably should get out.
Could you see activity on the streets? Did that alert you? Were there tanks or soldiers out and about?
It was very quiet that first day. Later on that first day, I did see a tank just moving around, but for the first few days, it was quite quiet. The sort of uproar happened a little while later.
And while you were there, you must have been thinking, I've got to get out at this point, because clearly you would have been in great danger. Were you thinking about trying to get out of Myanmar at that point?
I was, but I also made a mistake. I dilly-dallied around too long, to be honest, because it's one of those funny situations, right? So there I am living and working with my Burmese friends. I didn't want to be that person who just got out, to be that privileged foreigner who can flee at a moment's danger. And so I just felt that I sort of needed to stay for a bit. It's not that I made a decision to stay, but I just didn't make, I think, quick enough decisions as to try and get out. In my defence a little bit, because this was COVID, there were no regular flights anyway, so it would have been quite difficult to get out. But as I say, I did dilly-dally around a little bit too long, which really proved my undoing.
So with each passing day, you were in more and more danger. And then you received a warning. Tell me about this warning you received.
Yeah, so 5 days after the coup, on 6th of February 2021, I woke up and checked my emails, and always did, at about 5 in the morning, and there was an email from an unidentified friend, secret friend, who said, Sean, the military have now taken over your hotel. The CCTV system has been taken over and the cameras are on your door. You need to get out as soon as possible.
And what did you think when you read that email?
Well, I thought it's finally arrived, and I just thought, this is the moment. I've got to get out. I was very nervous. I remember putting clothes in my bag and my hands were shaking and so on, and just thinking about, what on earth do I do? The first thing I did, though, was to remember to call the Australian ambassador, Andrea Faulkner, who said, Sean, I'll come straight to the hotel, which he did. In the meantime, I went down to the lobby in order to get out, to meet Andrea and get away. And then I made another fatal mistake, Richard, which is being an economist and, like a tidy set of accounts, I went to the concierge to pay the bill, so instead of going out the back door of the hotel, I went into the lobby, presented my credit card to the concierge, and as I'm doing this, I could just feel all the military and the police coming in from behind me, and one of them stepped in front of me and said, "Mr. Turnell, you need to sit down, we need to talk."
What did the hotel staff do?
The hotel staff were absolutely wonderful. During the whole process that we just waited around in the lobby while the police decided what to do, they would send all sorts of signals to me about how unhappy they felt. They supplied me with food and all that. And then when the police decided that they were going to take me away and I was put in a paddy wagon, all the staff lined the very long driveway of this hotel and waved goodbye to me, and they were in tears. It's the most extraordinary thing. Some of them giving the three-fingered salute, which is the symbol that people in Asia usually give to demonstrate their hostility to authoritarian regimes. And so they were brave enough to do that. I was incredibly touched.
So there's tears for you, but were there also tears for the destruction of their hopes for a better future for their country as well?
I think absolutely. I got to know a lot of the staff. They were young, they were incredibly keen, they loved meeting foreigners, the country had opened up, future had shown itself in front of them, and now it was being closed off, and they understood that.
So what happened once they put you in custody like that?
So the first time in custody was awful, the first period I mean. So I was taken to a local police station first and sort of processed and all that, which was bizarre. And, I just a sort of mild-mannered academic type. I never get into trouble about anything. So when the handcuffs first clinched on me, that was a real moment, I'd have to say. And then being dragged off to this cell at the local police station, it was filthy and horrible, and there was a giant rat in it, and I was, just way out of my depth. Then I was moved at midnight away to this little establishment outside the walls of Yangon's famous insane prison.
It's called Insane Prison?
It's called Insane Prison. It's not spelt in the way we might think, but it sounds exactly the same, and it is a perfect description of the place. So I was put in a structure outside of that belonged to a special branch of the police, and I was put inside a cell inside this building, which thereafter I called the box, because it was a windowless room about the size of one of those small shipping containers, and I was placed in that and spent the next 2 months there.
What was inside the box?
Nothing except for one thing, which was a metal chair that was bolted down to the concrete floor, which had chains and manacles attached to it. So we were placed in that chair, handcuffed into the chair, leg irons in that chair.
You say we, you and who?
Oh, well, myself and other political prisoners later on. So very much a place to intimidate and to make people confess, etc.
Was this just an interrogation space, or were these your quarters for that time?
These were my quarters as well.
Was there a bed in there?
No. The embassy got me a mattress, were able to get me a mattress and a blanket and things like that, so I just slept on the floor, and the floor was hard and concrete and all the rest of it. But I remember there wasn't much room, and if you moved, you would sort of bang against the chair and cause the chains to rattle, which was a really horrible sound to hear, particularly when, you're having those 3 a.m. thoughts, and you were certainly let clear as to where you were and the horrifying situation.
When you said you had 3 a.m. thoughts, did you know what time of day it was?
No, that was one of the other problems. So I would presume they were 3 a.m. thoughts. But yeah, over time this became a real issue because there was no natural light in the box at all. There was no windows or anything. So very often I didn't know whether it was day or night. And that was part of the process, of course, to put me off balance. The interrogators would arrive at any time, very often in the middle of the night, and wake me up. So yeah, so it was very disorientating as well.
Were there lights on all the time in the box while you were being held there?
Yeah, lights were on all the time. I'd had the presence of mind to bring one of those eye shades that you get on planes. And in fact, I kept that eye shade for the next 2 years. But yeah, no, the lights on all the time. And in fact, all the time, the entire time I was imprisoned in Myanmar, I got really used to being in a room where the lights were on 24/7.
But Myanmar has blackouts too, doesn't it? Were you affected by those?
Sure were. So actually the lights did go out, but not on purpose. So there were lengthy periods where the blackouts caused the lights to disappear.
And then you would have been in total darkness.
Then in total darkness, particularly in the box, and so dark, the sort of dark where you put your hand right in front of your face and you can't see it.
What were you eating? Were you given anything decent to eat? Were you kept half-starved?
The food was terrible, Richard, throughout the whole period. It would arrive in a bucket, and it was sort of 3 items. There was a bucket of very badly boiled rice, another bucket which had a meat dish of some description, but by the time it got to me, was sort of just an oily patch at the bottom of the bucket, and then some sort of bean soup, which I think was probably the only thing that had any nutritional value. So the food was awful right across that period. So it did mean that I lost about 20% of my body weight across that period. So as a slimming opportunity, it certainly worked.
How were you treated by the guards?
Most of them were very good. And in fact, it was an interesting sign itself into the nature of the regime and the lack of support that they have amongst the general populace, that even the prison guards, even the police would sometimes send you little surreptitious signals and remarks that this was not them. They were often very careful to do that. So
were they ashamed, you think, by your arrest and imprisonment?
They were very ashamed. That in fact, that's the word for it, and apologetic, because this was totally at odds with Burmese people and their incredible hospitality. This was awful to them as individuals. Of course, there were some who were not so good, as in any sort of community, and I would imagine that, in the prison, it would draw some people who quite enjoyed lording it over prisoners and the like. But yeah, for the most part, the prison guards were pretty good.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler.
Nelson Mandela once said, you learn a lot about a regime and its weaknesses by being a prisoner, a political prisoner of that regime. When you were being interrogated, what did they want to know? Was it a real interrogation?
It wasn't a real interrogation at all, no. I mean, they were certainly after anything that could compromise Aung San Suu Kyi, so any sort of connection they could make between me and her and me and, say, the American government or the Australian government. They accused me at one point of working for MI6, bizarrely enough, not ASIO or the CIA, but very specifically MI6. But it was all pretty half-hearted. They knew that there wasn't anything there. Even the interrogators knew the absurdity of it. They were probably more interested about life in Australia, to be honest, and how things functioned here, how education worked. Was education free? Were medical services free? Things like that. So,
what was that about, do you think?
I think they'd had an opportunity to see the outside world and to understand just how far Myanmar had fallen behind. It had this brief window where things like that were possible, perhaps, in the future, and this was now being denied them. So I think they were sort of just curious about how other societies functioned.
What were you hearing beyond your cell, the box, at night, for example? Could you hear the outside world at work, or were you too cloistered inside the prison for that?
There were a couple of things I could hear, all pretty horrifying. One of them, and most horrifying all, was the sound of other prisoners being tortured. I could hear the screams of prisoners. Later I would meet some of those prisoners and I could see the scars and all the things done to them. And it was very hard, obviously, to get to sleep after hearing that and constantly be worried, very selfishly, that I might be next. More hopefully, I could hear the population in uproar. People banging pots and pans. I could hear sometimes protesters marching past the prison as well, because at this early point, the regime hadn't started shooting people at this point. That came a couple of weeks later. Most horrifying of all, every so often I could hear a plane going overhead. And whenever I heard that, I thought, oh, gosh, I wish I was on that plane, because, of course, it was the plane that would have been my liberation, right? And I remember imagining people having flight attendants coming around and offering them, a glass of champagne or something, and I could hear the plane going overhead.
How did you occupy your mind in the bleakness and emptiness of that tiny cell?
Occupying my mind was the number one thing, because I think I greatly feared running out of things to think about. In fact, I remember there's a wonderful line in Eric Lomax's book about the prison of war camps in Japan, and just talking about a prisoner who declared to everyone he'd run out of things to think about. And I remember that line coming to me as I'm sitting there. So I wanted to try and calm myself, and so I had all sorts of tricks. Number one when I was able to, was just to pace up and down. And I think all sentient beings do that, when they're locked up. And
how many steps was it from one end to the cell to the other?
It was 8 steps from one side of the cell to the other. So I would count the steps, and by the time midnight came around every single day, I was certain to get 10,000 steps. But the counting, the touching of the walls was oddly comforting. Then I started inventing games for myself, and the first of them was to remember every US president in chronological order, because I'm a big fan of US politics down the years, but I had nothing to check it, of course, but I just started to assemble it and started to think about, was Buchanan before Lincoln? Was Lincoln before Grant? I had a lot of trouble at that musical chairs just before the American Civil War, but anyway, eventually got it out. Then I went on to US states. Then I went on to Australian prime ministers, finally.
Barton, Deakin, Watson, Reid. Oh, yeah.
The order at that time gets very, very difficult, though.
Because Deakin keeps popping in and out. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Multiple appearances by the same Prime Minister.
But in such complications, you can absorb yourself.
Totally. Yeah. And I felt so good. I can remember when I got the states out, I felt so good, because I'd had a false alarm where I thought I'd got them all out, only to understand when I counted them on my fingers that I'd actually got 51 states.
You're also an economist, and a highly accomplished one. Are you able to kind of lose yourself in the complexities and the details of that world?
Sure did. And in fact, I recited the lectures that I used to give students in first-year economics. I assembled in my mind all the diagrams, and I would move from one economic model to another economic model by introducing more variables and making it more complex.
And are you doing this out loud as you're pacing?
Yes.
Well, they thought, this poor fellow, he's gone mad, I suppose they thought at the time. But in fact, you're going insane, really.
Absolutely. I did it under my breath at first, and then after a time I just thought, the hell with it. I'll just do it.
Tell me about a man you call Jacob, who was in that prison with you, another political prisoner.
Jacob was the most extraordinary man. He'd been taken in before me. He'd been arrested on charges of letting off bombs against the military. And as he said to me on multiple occasions, he said, Sean, yeah, of course. That's exactly what I did. I'm fighting against this military. Being a Muslim in Myanmar meant that he came under special bad attention from the military, from the word go, from the day he was born. But he was a wonderful man, a man of immense moral courage and moral standing. Such, in fact, that the guards were intimidated by him. He's just one of those people who just exuded strength and moral authority. But he was just wonderful to me in a practical way because, after I was taken out of the box, I was just put into the mainstream insane prison amongst all the criminals. And this prison was built in the 19th century. It's just an awful place. And I was completely at sea. And he helped me in every way. He got buckets for me. He cleaned my cell out. There was a toilet in the cell that hadn't been cleaned, I think, the day the cell was constructed in 1893. He just did everything. He cooked for me. He interceded on my behalf when at times...
Why did he do that?
I think he felt the same obligation to me that we spoke about earlier about Burmese people just feeling ashamed and sorry for what was happening to a foreigner, and this was just totally at odds with what Myanmar people were. He also knew that I worked for the National League for Democracy and with the democracy movement and all that. In fact, he even said to me on one point, he said, I know you're a friend of the lady, Aung San Suu Kyi. If I help you, I help her. That's enough. And he just saw the predicament, just how hopeless and helpless I was, and just stepped in. Just a wonderful man. And I really think I wouldn't be alive today if it wasn't for him, because he just interceded on my behalf in so many areas, so many times.
So your trial started in September that year. You were charged with a breach of the Official Secrets Act and an associated immigration charge. How did the proceedings unfold in that courtroom?
Total farce, from beginning to end. Even the building was a farce. For some reason, I don't know why, because Naypyidaw, where this trial was held, had plenty of courthouses, but they decided just to put it in a house that belonged to a former minister. But they tried to give all the accoutrements of a court. So they had, sort of railing that was designed to look like a dock. At one point, they had the coat of arms that they hung up on the wall, but the coat of arms fell down on a couple of occasions, which, to me was a metaphor for the whole thing.
And are you saying to yourself, I'm in a very dangerous position. I must not laugh. Are you doing that while this is going on?
Totally. In fact, there were numerous times where I wanted to laugh, where
Yeah.
the evidence given against me was so farcical that I really wanted to laugh. But
Right, what were you accused of doing, though? What were some of these farcical charges of malfeasance on your part?
Yeah, so, I mean, I was essentially being accused of being a spy, but a master spy. So it wasn't just that I had documents that I shouldn't have had and things like that, but actually that I was directing Aung San Suu Kyi and the other ministers of the state who were on the same charge, but that they were doing things for me, and I was the one pulling the strings.
Oh, you were the puppet master, the foreign puppet master. Is that what it was?
I was the puppet master because, see, the military have always tried to lay on Suu Kyi the idea that somehow she's beholden to foreign influence and that, her husband was British, her children live in the UK, etc. So they've always tried this line. So I was fodder for that.
So, given that you were a very, very senior advisor in the government, what was the official secret that you had that you shouldn't have had?
Well, it was never outlined properly. And in fact, down the track, the very last day of the trial, the judge even acknowledged that as a foreigner, the Official Secrets Act didn't apply to me. But then said, in a particularly comic moment, he said, no matter. We have to consider the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law, the vibe, I think we call it in Australia, said that I was a spy and needed to be punished. So, yeah, it was the most extraordinary thing.
Did you get to make a statement? Could you speak to the court on your own behalf?
So the trial lasted a whole year, and I was told on the very last day, on sentencing, and they even used that expression before I'd been found guilty, by the way, that on the sentencing date I would get to make a statement. Right at that last day, I was told that I had 3 minutes. So I prepared my thoughts and I came up with something and I thought, wow, this is great. I'm going to really nail it. Stood up, started my speech of 3 minutes. About 90 seconds in, the judge signalled me to stop and said, Mr. Turnell, sit down, your time is over. So I never even, after a year of waiting, I never even got to make my proper statement. I think I'd done nothing more than sort of vaguely introduce myself and how much I liked Myanmar before being told to sit down.
So you were found guilty. What was your sentence for you?
So the sentence was 4 years for the Official Secrets Act and another 4 years for breaching the Immigration Act because, of course, by being a spy, I was also in breach of my visa. So that added the other 4 years. But the sentences were meant to run concurrently. So it meant overall I would have spent 4 years.
How much work was going on behind the scenes during this time for your release?
A huge amount of work, which I expected, but since I was released and came back, I realised that the extent of the work was much greater than I thought. I thought my arrest would cause uproar in Australia. I knew my wife and my family and so on would be battling for me, but yeah, I didn't realise the extent of it, that actually people all around the world were mobilised. There were leaders in Asia, the United States, Europe, UK, all mobilising to get me out. So yeah, the extent of it was a bit of a shock.
How about your wife, Hart? Were you able to remain in any kind of contact with her during your incarceration?
For the first few months, no. And while I was in the box, I was held without any contact at all. After a couple of months, though, I was able to get a phone call. And thereafter, I would be able to talk to her about once every couple of weeks, just on the phone for 20 minutes. So there was no in-person visits at all allowed, even by the ambassador. So I was pretty isolated, but I could talk to her every couple of weeks, and I was able to get news from home, give her some news back. But of course I had to be very guarded in what I said because I was in a room with about 10 other prison guards, representatives from the military, from other security services, all furiously taking notes. Everything I said was recorded. So I had to sort of vaguely speak in code back to her in order to get messages across. But of course it was a code that wasn't worked out beforehand. So we had to sort of play it by ear, if you like, at getting information across.
What was she able to say to you to buoy you up at that time?
Probably the most important thing was just simply that people cared and that friends, relatives, the Australian government, all people around the world were doing things. I think that was the most heartening thing of all because I think there's a particular fear that you'll be forgotten and that, you go through all this stuff and it won't be for anything. You'll just die forgotten and alone over there. So knowing that was incredibly uplifting, even in moments where I wasn't sure that I was going to make it and that I might die over there.
One thing I've been told about these situations is that regimes put a lot of energy into inflicting shame on you as the political prisoner to make you feel wretched and almost make you think, there's part of you that starts to think that you deserve what's happened to you. There's the shame you mentioned there of the manacles. You know, you're a nice law-abiding citizen, a well-respected academic. To be put in manacles is a shaming thing. Yeah. It's very hard to resist that, apparently. Was it hard for you to resist that? Did you have those feelings of like, there's part of me that deserves this bad treatment?
Totally. I mentioned the accoutrements of the courtroom and so on, but all of that is designed, I think, to do exactly that, to give you the impression that you're at fault, you've done something wrong. And you mentioned the manacles. That was definitely when it worked most powerfully. I remember at one point having leg irons put on. And these weren't modern, by the way. They were sort of rusty old iron manacles around my hands and then the leg irons.
Ones the British might have used back in the day.
Totally. I felt like a convict. That was all I could think about. One of the books that I eventually was able to read in the prison was actually The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes. So that was very much on my mind. And given that, you know, Insane Prison in many ways sort of resembled Port Arthur, I mean, even the architecture and so on. So, yeah, so that was a very shameful moment, I think. And you really had to struggle to get that out of your head.
After being moved around, you write that you were eventually housed in a prison, a segment of the prison, which you realised was actually death row. Clearly was intended to intimidate you. Did you think you might actually be up for a bullet at some point, Sean?
It was a final twist of intimidation. So this came after I was found guilty, taken back from Naypyidaw, back to insane prison and, put on death row. I think, again, it was, you know, a final message of them that this is what will happen if you come at us. And as a foreigner, if you interfere, this is what we'll do. And I did fear, you know, all sorts of things happening because at the trial I was found guilty of being a spy, but one of the things that saved me from ultimate punishment was that I wasn't found to be a spy with respect to military secrets, because that would have led to the death penalty or life imprisonment. And of course, in that environment, you question everything. And I started to worry, am I going to get charged anew? Am I being put here? And a whole raft of new charges, perhaps military charges, might be coming my way. So, yeah, it was a particularly horrifying experience that last few months.
And what did you discover had become of your friend Jacob?
So probably a day or two after realising I was now in the death row area, I had a question for my interpreter, actually the prison interpreter, and I said to him, look, where is Jacob? Because, of course, he'd stayed in insane when I was taken up to Naypyidaw. And he hesitated and said, oh, Jacob is not here. And my first reaction was, oh, that's fantastic. He's been released. He must have got amnesty. And I said, oh, that's great. And then the interpreter said to me, no, Sean, you don't understand. He's dead. There had been a fight in the prison, but it had been a stage fight between two prisoners. Jacob intervened to try and separate them and calm things down, which was very him. You know, I mentioned his moral authority and so on that he had. And then in this melee, the two prisoners who were pretending to fight then turned on him, and then the prison guards got involved as well and basically beat him and kicked him to death. He lingered on apparently overnight on the floor of the prison hospital, but died later that morning. An awful end to a marvellous human being.
So tell me about the moment you found out you were going to be released after nearly 2 years of captivity.
It came as a total shock. It was the 17th of November, 2022. It was a normal day in my prison cell there in the death row area. The previous day, I'd had one of my regular calls with Ha, and we'd both agreed that circumstances were such that I wouldn't be home for Christmas, that I'd lose another Christmas. And so I was feeling particularly low. Then suddenly this prison guard just suddenly appeared at my cell door and said, good news, Sean, you're going home. And my first reaction was, please tell me you're not kidding. And he said, no, it's absolutely the case. But you've got 10 minutes. You've got to get all your stuff and get out. And I remember just not knowing what to do. This day that I'd spent nearly 2 years waiting for was there, and I almost felt like I couldn't move until eventually I did, and I looked at my belongings and tried to think about what to take, and then I remembered an instruction from her. She said, "Bring nothing home." So, as it turned out, I did grab some favourite books, and there was a couple of little items that I wanted to keep. But yeah, and then was escorted to the prison gate, taken in a bus to Yangon Airport, where I was then introduced into the equivalent of the first-class lounge at the airport, and there was the Australian ambassador, the American ambassador, the Japanese ambassador, drinking champagne and so on, and I was in this bedraggled outfit, feeling incredibly happy, of course, but still worried. I'm still worried that this might be all reversed and I might be charged with something, so I was then put on a plane for Bangkok. But I do remember the moment where I started to think, okay, I think I'm free, was I looked down to the paddy fields of Thailand and saw that they were long strips, whereas paddy fields in Burma tend to be squares. And I thought, okay, I think we're coming into Bangkok. And sure enough, this massive city loomed up and I thought, I'm free.
After you got back, 2 weeks after your release, 2 weeks after you were pardoned by the state, which enabled your release, you got a letter in the mail that revoked your pardon and said, what, you were required back in a courtroom in Myanmar? What the hell's that about? I mean, as if you're going to go back for that. What's that about, do you think, Sean?
By the time the letter got to me, the demand was for the next day for me to appear in a Yangon courthouse. So even if I'd been minded to get back, I wouldn't have been able to do it. But my initial reaction was just a chill of fear went up and down my spine. And then after that, though, I didn't worry about it. I thought, well, come on, what could they do? Until actually I then spoke, in detail to Foreign Affairs about it. And they said, Sean, look, this is a problem because if you decide to travel around, this could be an issue at airports around the world. The Myanmar regime, no matter how despotic it is and how on the nose it is diplomatically, they do have access to Interpol and all the rest of it. So it continues to have an effect on me. Actually, I have to pre-arrange when I leave Australia, and the Department of Foreign Affairs has been wonderful over this at settling things down for me, whichever route I'm going. But yeah, but it still has its effect. But I think above all psychological, because it's the regime saying that we can reach you still. You're still not entirely free of our clutches.
So in that time you worked as an advisor for that 5-year period with Aung San Suu Kyi. Much of the world has become very disappointed in her for her failure to intervene in the genocide against the Rohingya, the Muslim population of Myanmar. She's almost defended in some ways. What do you think about all that, Sean?
Well, I got to see the inside story of what she was trying to do. She made a number of political mistakes, but in my view, not moral ones, in that I knew that what she was trying to do to get the military off. But I think she made a fundamental error, because I think her plan was to get leverage over the military. Now, that meant that she did some things that I think in retrospect she wouldn't approve of either. But the motivation was to get some sort of leverage over the military because, as I mentioned earlier, they were autonomous to the civilian government and could act more or less as they liked. But there was an effort on her part, I think, to try and make them dependent upon the civilian government, and then she could exert pressure on them. Behind the scenes as well, people like myself were trying to work out ways that we could get at the military economically and financially. So we had some financial intelligence about some of the people who were committing genocide in Rakhine State against the Rohingya. So we were able to do some things behind the scenes. It was never enough and never would have been enough. And as I say, I think she made some terrible errors when it came to making public statements on it. But I know from talking to her about it that she felt deeply about this, and in retrospect I think fell into the trap that the military had laid, because the military were always trying to drive a wedge between her and the civilian government in Myanmar generally and the international community, and that worked. Just an awful situation, and certainly a terrible situation for me, because, I'd gone there with the idea that economics could be the foundations for democracy, human rights, things like that. So I had many dark nights of the soul during the period that I was there as well.
Are you haunted by your captivity? Do you get nightmares about it?
I do. Yeah, so I don't think about it on a daily basis, and in waking hours it almost seems like a story to me that I've read. It's getting to that now. The big problem, it comes at night in the form of nightmares, and I have a particular nightmare that comes up all the time, which is I'm in the prison, I get some letter authorising my release, and I pack my bag and I'm escorted out of my cell, and I arrive at the main gate and I present the bit of paper, and the guard looks through it and finds there's a missing stamp or a date that's wrong or a signature that's not in the right place, and I get pushed back to the cell. So I have some variant on that all the time, which is interesting actually because it's almost the inverse of another dream that I used to have in the prison, which that I had been released, I was back in Sydney, back with friends and families, we'd be at a dinner party and the night would be going on, and I would look at my watch and I would say to everyone, I have to get back. I've got to get back before the cell doors close.
You must know something about your own resilience. You'd have to realise, I suspect you know now you're a much more resilient person than perhaps you ever suspected you were. Would that be right to say that?
I think so. I think I have a strong fantasy life as well, Richard. So I'm able to imagine a lot of things. So I think I have a capacity to withdraw a bit. Speaking a little bit against myself, the flip side of that is that I think I'm one of those people who sometimes just doesn't pay attention. So the idea of sort of being an academic who doesn't really know what's going on in the world, part of that was, I think, a story of my protection. Self-protection.
Aung San Suu Kyi is now again under house arrest, and it seems like that's probably where she'll spend the rest of her days, doesn't it? We live in a kind of an international democratic recession. Seems pretty grim, doesn't it, the outlook for places like Myanmar?
I think it is grim, unfortunately, Richard. I think the regime just want to wait it out. Aung San Suu Kyi is 78, and they were just waiting for her to die, basically. I mean, just to say it really bluntly. She's held in awful conditions. They're really using her as a human shield now because the military are beginning to lose militarily and just about every other way, and there have been attacks on the capital. So her presence in the capital is sort of, I think, used as something of a disincentive, if you like, to the opposition forces that, hey, attack us and, you may end up hitting her. So just an awful situation. I'm a little bit optimistic, though, because, again, the military are losing. I'm also optimistic just at the Burmese opposition. They're extraordinary people, mostly a different cohort than before, different generation, very savvy, real nous about the world, had experienced freedom and so on, and desperate to get it back. So I'm confident on their part, but I think before they get back and Burma becomes free again, I think there's still many horrors to come. So, I temper my optimism and my hopes for the country on understanding there could be an awful lot of suffering still to go.
Sean, it's been amazing speaking with you. What an extraordinary story you have to tell. Such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Richard.
Sean Turnell's memoir is called An Unlikely Prisoner. Today's conversation was produced on the lands of the Gadigal, Turrbal and Jagera peoples. Producer is Alice Moldovan and our EP is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.